COP. We'll just wait a couple of minutes to give everyone a chance to join the webinar. Okay, the numbers are climbing quickly. I can see we've actually had more than 500 people register for this webinar. So it'll be interesting to see how many of you are able to join us live. And obviously a number of you will be looking at the recording as well. Okay, we might get started. So yes, this is our 5th AusPos COP, our 5th Australian Positive Organisational Scholarship Community of Practice. So thank you for joining us, and obviously a very popular and interesting topic that we're dealing with this time around purpose, meaning and values driving the positive organisation. So just to introduce your co-hosts, first of all, my colleague and partner in crime, Dr. Susie Green, clinical and coaching psychologist and founder and CEO of the Positivity Institute. And I'm excited to announce her honorary role, which is an adjunct professor for us here at UTS Business School. Hi, Susie.
Hello, everyone, and thank you. Very excited to be here again.
And myself, Dr. Rosemary Sainty, currently a business school academic here at UTS with a background in a range of things, including the UN Global Compact and community services and other things. So before we get started, just an acknowledgement of country. UTS Business School respectfully acknowledges that we're located on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. The Gadigal people have cared for their community, land and waters for thousands of generations based on their deep knowledge of their country. We pay our respects to their ancestors, their elders, and acknowledge their ongoing status as the first peoples of this land. And in my own teaching practice, I've integrated Indigenous approach with this concept of Yindyamarra, a Wiradjuri word, which actually means mutual respect, giving honour and taking responsibility. So what is the purpose of the POSCOP? This really came about from discussions with those of us that are either in academia, research, teaching, and other colleagues and friends from the field of practice. And really, it's about supporting all of us, researchers, teachers, practitioners, interested in fostering positive organisations through deliberative forums. And we've developed a sort of a prototype in a way of inviting experts and leaders and interested people into the discussion, forming a community of practice. And we'd also like to make a sort of a thank you again to the founders of Positive Organisational Scholarship from the Centre for Positive Organisations at the Ross School of Business, University of Michigan, for their support. And of course, our special guest speaker today is from that group. A bit of webinar housekeeping. So we're recording the webinar, and for all of you that have RSVP'd, you'll receive a link following today, and we'll also put together a web page where we'll be able to put up any resources or references that have been discussed through the morning. We're very keen to have an active chat, so please post your comments as we go through the morning, and certainly our speakers have indicated they're happy for that to take place and may even be able to be interrupted depending on how that conversation is going. We'll have the Q&A Zoom function working too, if you could post your questions there for the panel, and we'll come to that later on in the session. And for accessibility, we have closed captions that are available. So the agenda. So today is about a rapid escalation in the conversation about values-led purpose and meaning, organisationally and personally, in a context of ongoing disruption and uncertainty in so many aspects of our lives and our workplaces. So this is how we've set the discussion up for today. Susie and I have given ourselves 5 minutes to introduce the topic, both from our different areas of expertise. So Susie will be talking about purpose in life, and I'll do a brief piece on organisational purpose. And then we'll have our panellists' perspectives. First of all, Professor Emeritus Robert Quinn, Bob, leading thinker and academic and a POS co-founder. Bob will be talking about the power of purpose and providing us with a brief overview. We'll then hear from Professor Carl Rhodes, the Dean of the UTS Business School here at UTS, on leading a progressive business school. And then our third speaker, Corene Strauss, who is the CEO of the Australian Disability Network, on leading dynamic not-for-profit organisations. Once we've heard from our 3 speakers, we'll move to a panel discussion and then open it up to a Q&A for all of you to be able to join in the discussion. Okay, so we'll first begin with Susie and my brief of 5 minutes. So Susie Grant is a clinical and coaching psychologist and founder and CEO of the Positivity Institute, a positively deviant business dedicated to the promotion of wellbeing in workplaces and schools. Susie, would you like to introduce us to your topic?
Thanks so much, Rosemary, and welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us again. I also want to give a call out to Professor Todd Kashton, who I think is on the call today, for his support, not just in preparation for today's webinar, but over the last 20 years, Todd. I think when I first started teaching at Sydney Uni on applied positive psychology and was looking at a lecture on meaning, there really wasn't much around back in 2004, besides Frankel's work and a couple of early studies. So I did find some papers by Todd Kashton and Michael Steger, who have become wonderful colleagues of mine now, and they have very kindly supported me in my understanding of both meaning and purpose. Next slide, Rosemary. So the topic is a big one, which clearly in 5 minutes I will only be very briefly covering. There is some confusion even within the scientific community around the terms meaning in life, purpose in life. I often, when I'm explaining it to people, sometimes it's more like people necessarily don't want to know the meaning of life, which is a huge question, but most people want meaning in their life. But when we're talking about purpose in life, and I'm really drawing on Todd's work here, there was an incredibly important paper published by Todd and McKnight, 2009, which really gave a wonderful definition that I've been able to memorize and quote over the years, which that purpose in life is a central self-organizing life aim. So it's central because it becomes a predominant theme of a person's identity. And if I just pause for a moment, Rosemary, and I'm sure this is where you and I are aligned and why we are working collaboratively, is that I have for a significant period of my life felt that this is my calling. And of course, there's been some wonderful work that's come out of the Centre for Positive Organisations differentiating job, career and calling. And so for me, my purpose in life, I have a family and that's very, very purposeful to me, but this has become a predominant theme of my identity, who I am. I read the scientific literature for fun, but I'm always thinking about, as a practitioner, how may this or may this not apply. It's self-organizing in as much as that it provides this incredible intrinsic motivation and energy. And for people that know me will know that zest, energy, vitality is one of my top strengths. And I truly believe that that has become stronger and stronger over the years, that I've been more connected to my sense of purpose. And it is a life aim. It's a long-term commitment. I've quoted there the wonderful work by Ken Sheldon that was on self-concordant goals, so goals that align to our core values. And I also was reading, I believe in Todd's paper, that as a life aim, it's also the acknowledgement and recognition that we may never achieve that in our lifetime. And I think that's a really important talking point that I'd love Bob in particular to speak to today. Next slide. Todd and colleagues also recognised that there were 3 dimensions to evaluate how much a person's life is actually driven by purpose. So the strength, Is it a weak purpose or a strong purpose, and the influence that has on our behavior? Again, using myself as a sample, it has a very strong influence. And in fact, Rosemary, I know today you'd like to at some point speak to the dark side of purpose, and I'm sure I can attest to that, as can many other people listening today. Also the scope, so the range of our life domains. And for me, again, there'll be lots of people on this call today that have had conversations with me outside of my profession, and you'll know that I somehow managed to weave in some aspect of positive psychology or my purpose into my personal domain. And then thirdly, awareness, the degree to which there's conscious clarity and articulation. So for me, that conscious awareness became stronger over time. But I find that also very interesting that for some people, there may not be a strong degree of awareness. And I'm also interested in understanding how that develops. Again, that might be something that comes up in our conversation today. And next slide, Rosemary. This is a quote from a paper that I have quoted many, many years by McGregor and Little in 2009. And I think I quoted it in one of our previous POSCOPs, Rosemary. And I find this interesting, this research that shows that highly successful executives had habituated to their success. And we often do see this potentially after you've achieved a certain amount of success in your career. So it says, suggesting that it's leaving integrity as the primary source of their well-being, and that concerns with efficacy had been supplemented by developmental concerns of generativity, leaving a positive legacy and guiding future generations and meaning. And again, that strongly aligns to where I'm at in this stage of my career. Next slide. And I won't have a lot of time to talk to this today, but it's something that I'm very, very involved in and learning, very much still learning about adult development theory and leadership maturity, working quite closely with Dr. Maja Stanajevic-Andre at the moment from the Institute for Developmental Coaching, and understanding that particularly from a leadership perspective, that we can move through these stages of leadership maturity. And if you can see from the image there, which is a beautiful image of this move from knowledge, which tends to occur when you're developing your career and you're becoming an expert and an achiever. But then as we move into these post-conventional stages, there's a shift in the way that we see the world. We see the systems and the interactions. And this alignment can also, or this recognition can also bring a greater sense of awareness of our purpose and meaning. Again, I just wanted to make a very brief link there, because I'm sure there are people on here today, coaches in particular, that have been doing also a lot of work in adult development. So I just wanted to make that link. But it is a big topic, Rosemary. And so I'd like to hand over to you now to expand this in terms of its application in organisations.
Okay, thanks, Susie. We're down to 1 minute now. So I have just packed this slide full of the things that I think I'd like to put into this conversation. So this is the organisational perspective on purpose from a management scholar, myself, point of view. And so on the left-hand side of the slide, just a kind of historic kind of look at this, organisational scholars have been looking at purpose and organisations for some time, and there's a quote there from Mary Parker Follett, and this involves, an understanding that organisations develop a distinctive character with meaning and value that goes beyond technical efficiency and economic performance. So this has been a long-standing conversation here, but really more recently, I guess because of things like the normalized bad behavior and loss of trust in business and profit maximization, corporate calamities, if you like, the idea of the purpose of the corporation has really risen up in the literature and in conversation and in business. So the two quotes that I've got there, the first from Colin Mayer from the UK, the purpose of business is to solve the problems of people and planet profitably and not profit from causing problems. Sort of a negative focus, I suppose, but it's actually calling to account the organisational side of things here. And the second quote, quite often used by colleagues, it comes from the US Business Roundtable companies should serve not only their shareholders, but also deliver value to their other stakeholders. So this kind of plays to this stakeholder capitalism view that's taking hold. But you can see these they're quite big shifts in terms of organisational purpose. Very recently, there's a very helpful special edition of a special issue on corporate purpose from a journal called Strategy Science, which I'd commend to you. And there's a link at the bottom of the slide there on this. And a particular article from Besharov and Mitzanik, I just wanted to point this out as a way of helping sort of make sense of what we're talking about from an organisational point of view with purpose. So according to these authors, and I'm just going to briefly read off my notes here, there's 3 types of purpose enactment. Once again, this is the organisational perspective that provides that organisational context for the enactment of purpose. And so the 3 types that these authors identify: first type of purpose as the reason for being of the organisation, so where organisational members find meaningfulness and alignment from within the actual purpose of the organisation itself. The second is purpose as an alternative to profit maximisation. So this is where we see businesses now looking beyond just profit and into what sorts of positive social impacts they can make, or environmental, a sort of broader view, a kind of hybrid view of balancing and looking at purpose from a broader perspective. And then finally, purpose as a catalyst for systemic change. And this is really where organisations are wanting to take an external focus and actually play a role in shaping broader economic, political, social, environmental systems in which they operate. And we see this in initiatives such as the UN Global Compact. There's constraints that have to be recognised to have meaningful impact within and beyond the firm. The purpose must be embedded in the organisation structures, or you risk value incoherence, and that's a problem with burnout. Another constraint: purpose sits alongside profit in business organisations, and this can give rise to tensions. And finally, from a systems perspective, where organisations are really wanting to drive big-time change, they can come up against institutional inertia, where the markets, regulation, business associations, even business schools aren't there yet with this kind of thinking. So let's move on now to our speakers, having provided that very brief context. And I'd like to introduce our special guest for today. So Professor Robert Quinn, Bob, the co-founder and faculty advisory board member of the Centre for Positive Organisations, and the Margaret Elliott Tracy Professor Emeritus at the University of Michigan Ross School of Business. Bob is in the top 1% of professors cited in organisational behaviour textbooks, the author of 18 books, including Deep Change, The Economics of Higher Purpose, the widely acclaimed Harvard Business Review article, Creating a Purpose-Driven Organisation, and has one of the highest rates of repeat invitations in the speaking industry. So we're really lucky to be able to have you here with us today, Bob. Thank you.
I'm absolutely delighted to be with you. Let me get these slides up. There we go. I'd like to spend a few minutes, I want to kind of sort of cut this in half, spend a few minutes building on both of the things you two just talked about. I want to spend a few minutes on personal purpose and then turn to organizational purpose, because I think they really help to enlighten each other. Let me start with a personal case. It's about my daughter. She was getting older. She was quite happy not being married, and then all of a sudden the biological clock started ticking and she started to speak differently. And then she'd said, my problem is there's not a decent man left on the planet my age worth marrying. And things started to get kind of tense. And then all of a sudden, Prince Charming rode into the picture. And things were great for about 3 months. And then I walked in my wife's study and she was on the phone. It was clear she was talking to my daughter. It was clear what happened. This guy had just dumped her. And she was devastated. She's our firstborn, and firstborn children tend to have a tendency, if they're miserable, they want you to be miserable too. And she said, I'm coming home this weekend. I thought, oh no. And my wife said, you're the father, you go pick her up at the airport. So I did. She got in the car. She didn't say, hello, how are you? She's that no good, dirty. Da, da, da. For 5 minutes, she went on, finally took a breath. I said, are you problem solving or are you purpose finding? She didn't even hear me. She went on for another 5 minutes. Well, this process repeated 4 times. The fifth time, we're pulling in the driveway. And I said, are you problem solving or purpose finding? She went dead quiet. She said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, I wrote that letter to your brother about purpose finding and problem solving, sent you a copy. She interrupted me. She said, this is the real world. By then we're in the house. I reached into a file cabinet, pulled out a sheet of paper that said Robert Quinn life statement. She ripped it out of my hand. She started to look at it. She slowed down. She looked up and she said, when you feel bad, you read this? And I said, no. When I feel bad, I rewrite it. It's been rewritten hundreds of times. She said, yeah, I can hardly understand some of this stuff. I said, well, it's written to a customized audience of one. And then the first miracle happened. She said, do you think I could write one of these? I said, I am absolutely sure you can. And for the next day and a half, she disappeared into a room working on her life statement. So the first miracle is I didn't have to suffer for a day and a half. The second miracle occurred 3 days later. She was back where she was working. She sent me an email and she said, he called me. And I said, well, it's going to be an interesting email. She tells the story of the call, and she said, when he hung up, I decided to write him this letter, and she included the letter. The letter was breathtaking. It was incredibly vulnerable and authentic. Here's how I felt when I met you. Here's how I felt when things were going good. Here's how I felt when you dumped me. It was just a stunning letter. The next line said, but my roommates said, you can't give this to him. Now, if you stop and pause for a moment and say, why not? The answer is really clear. Dating is a marketplace. Dating is like business, and it's a transactional realm. And then when someone dumps you, you don't give them vulnerable feelings. You don't lose control to them. You can't give this to this guy. Now, here's the stunning response. She said, what my roommates don't understand is that what he thinks doesn't matter. Now, 3 days before, what he thought caused her life to shatter. Now she's saying what he thinks doesn't matter. She's clarified her purpose. She has a much greater sense of who she is. Her strength has skyrocketed. And what he thinks doesn't matter. So I can tell him the truth. Now, that's truly stunning. And I want to emphasize, outside the comprehension of her roommates who have a conventional mindset, the same mindset that each one of us learned when we were 2 years old, that we've lived by all our lives. The purpose process takes us outside a mindset we've always lived in. Now, what I want to look at next very quickly is just some of the findings from research on what happens to people who have a purpose and strive to live by it. They live longer. They're less likely to have a heart attack or stroke or Alzheimer's. They sleep better at night. They're more relaxed during the day. If they have an addiction, they have twice the chance of recovery as people who don't have purpose. The purpose leads to strengthened immune system, good cholesterol, better sex, more friends in the social network, more meaning, engagement, life satisfaction, happiness, making more money. Now, this list comes from a literature review done by Vic Strecker. And Vic, when he shares it, says, if I told you that as I was an entrepreneur and I was starting a company that had a pill that would produce these outcomes, would you invest in my company? The answer is yes, I would. This is a stunning list. When I look at this list, there's a message that speaks to me every time, and it says, you and I are designed to become purpose-driven organisms. We are going to experience optimal functioning much more frequently when we are living a purpose-driven life. And this list is actually getting dated, and more things pop in all the time. The message is incredibly powerful at the personal level. Now, I've spent a great deal of my time on organizational purpose, both in terms of research and in terms of practice, and I've worked with lots of organizations on organizational purpose. The first thing I'd like to do is to make a differentiation between purpose and three other concepts. One is mission. That's the objective of the organization. The example that here's from DTE Energy, we want to be the best operated energy company. Well, you could measure whether or not you were doing that. That's what we do. I get lots of calls from lots of companies, and usually it's too late. The CEO has been pressured to find a purpose. He's set a task force of middle managers. They've worked for 3 months. They're going to announce it next week, and they want me to come give a talk. I say, okay, what's your purpose? 9 times out of 10, their purpose statement is their mission, their objective, what they already know they're doing. We manufacture checks. It's their task. They can't get beyond that. When I tell them that's not a purpose, they go berserk because they're already committed, and they're unwilling to even think further about it. There's a strategy. When Eisner took over Disney, he held a press conference and he uttered a brilliant sentence. He said, hold me responsible for one thing and one thing only. And that is, we will double the number of films made each year. We will make 16 films next year. Now, within an hour, every employee at Disney knew that sentence. And that organization started to change immediately. That was a brilliant statement of strategy. Strategy is how we're going to do something. Vision is an action image. For example, at Microsoft, they had the well-known vision of a laptop on every desk. That was a very powerful image. It didn't necessarily mean that they were going to have a laptop on every desk, but it was a guiding image that could unify. All three of those notions are about the future in some form or fashion. Purpose is inherently different, in my mind, than those three things. Very similar, overlapping in many ways, but purpose is not about contract. Contract is the central concept of the conventional mindset. We all live in a transactional world, and it's made up of contracts and of exchange, some formal, some informal. A covenant is a very different animal than a contract. I put my sacred honor at stake. I'm giving you complete trust. You give me complete trust. We're going to take care of each other's welfare. An example is a company we worked with for quite a while. It was a food company, and the higher purpose was we nurture growth in all that we do. That's a really interesting statement for a food company. It works. We're making food that nurtures growth. But this CEO was fairly unusual in that he understood higher purpose. Most of them don't and cannot understand it. His direct reports did not understand it so well. We did 4 lengthy workshops with that group to get them where they could understand what they were about. Now, one of the things we said to them in that workshop was, okay, if we nurture growth in all that we do, that's not just making food, it's all that we do. So how are you going to fire people differently this year than you did last year? If you're nurturing growth in all you do, including the person you're firing, you can't fire them the way you used to fire people. Now, they were paralyzed by that thought. All of them except the CEO. That happened just before the pandemic. The pandemic hit. We were interviewing some of the middle managers over Zoom calls, and we had a very unusual experience. I often say to the middle manager, do you believe the CEO lives this? And the answer is often negative. They said, absolutely. So, well, why do you believe that? He says, well, the pandemic hit. We've got these customers. We had all these complications of protecting people's lives. So the CEO hired private jets to fly the engineers to the customers in the morning and fly them home at night. That's an astounding step. That's not an expectation. It's outside expectation. Higher purpose leads people to positive deviance. They deviate from the norm in positive directions. That's what a higher purpose does. In 99% of every Fortune 500 has a purpose on the website, not everyone, but most. And most of them are PR statements, right? No one believes that they have any consequence, and no one thinks about them having any consequence. In the book we wrote, we concluded after we wrote the book, the single most important word in that book was the word authentic. It's an authentic higher purpose. In that food company, that CEO was completely authentic about the words nurture, growth, and all we do. And it influenced him to do all kinds of strange innovations that made that purpose real in that company. Most CEOs cannot conceive of doing such a thing. They cannot conceive of having a purpose that's the arbiter of every decision. It's unimaginable. But that's what a higher purpose in organization does. So very quickly, let me hit on some of the key points that we make in the book that are counterintuitive. The first one is the moment you talk about getting a higher purpose, CEOs think, okay, I'll appoint this task force, they'll go to work on this, and we'll find our higher purpose, or we'll hire a PR firm. We're going to invent it. You don't invent the higher purpose, you discover it. It already exists. It's in all your people. If you listen to those people, make it possible for them to talk and explore, you eventually find that purpose. We had a dean of a school that was doing very poorly. The new dean, Blease, said, I can't be a dean. I've never even read a book about leadership. And yet she had incredible instincts. The first thing she did is she interviewed every person in the school. She said the interviews were so interesting. 90% of the interview was garbage when I asked them about purpose, but 10% was a jewel. And I would go home and ponder those jewels, interview after interview, and then put the jewels together. And by the end, she had a 3-point purpose. She said, this is what our school's about. A large number of professors immediately left. That sounds like a bad outcome. Professors all over the world were attracted to the school. Within a couple of years, the school had radically transformed. It was operating to a purpose. The purpose had real consequences, produced real systemic change. Purpose is not an aspirin. It's a tool that puts you into the world of very hard work. The second point is the one I made about authenticity. It's absolutely real. The reason you have to make that point is that in our transactional theory of life, we believe people are self-interested, resources are scarce, and conflict is natural. My job is to be very smart and to be more clever than you and to win the resources we're competing for. And so I do whatever's convenient in that moment to win the game. The purpose is constant. It is not moving. It's not compromised. We nurture growth in all that we do. It never goes away. I know a man at the Bank of America who was just incredibly proficient in the world of purpose. And he made the statement, constancy is the one thing that always defeats culture. If you have a purpose and it's absolutely constant and you talk about it every day, every meeting, every conversation, eventually that system will change. Most systems don't change around these things. And probably the biggest empirical study we have on purpose showing positive outcomes, one of the conclusions was if you don't enroll middle management, it will not work. Now, with that group of people that in the food company, we did those 4 long workshops. We taught them and taught them. They finally got it. They started putting it in place. And the first thing they said to us was, we'll send out an email to middle management. We said, did you not hear a word we've said? If you send out an email to middle management, you are wasting every dollar you've invested so far, because this is not going to work. You're going to have to do something you're not used to doing. Instead of managing, you're going to have to lead. You're going to have to go to middle management and convert them, make them believe that this purpose is real. You're going to have to enroll them and change them. And when they do, then you have a chance of having this purpose make a difference. The third level that many companies never get to, a few of them do, and a few of them do it brilliantly, is to get all the way to the bottom of the system, where virtually everybody in the system knows the purpose, believes it's authentic, sees it as constant, and their lives begin to organize around that purpose. Those are a few of the things to consider. They can be provocative, so I imagine we deal with a number of questions. But let me stop there, and we can return to whatever you'd like to talk about afterwards.
Okay, so Susie, over to you to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks so much, Rosemary, and thanks so much, Bob. I could listen to you all day. So I'd like to introduce Professor Carl Rhodes, and very excited to be speaking with Carl today. Carl is the Dean of the UTS Business School, and he's also responsible not just for the academic, but the strategic leadership of the school, and in its commitment to be a socially committed business school, which I think today is very much about. Prior to his academic career, Carl also worked in professional and senior management positions in change management and organisational development. So Carl, can you tell us a little bit about your journey to leading a socially committed business school? Oh, you're on mute.
Anyone would have thought I've never used Zoom before, Susie. But thanks for that very warm introduction. Hello, everybody, and thank you for using a very old and somewhat flattering photograph of me in that opening slide as well. You know, to be frank, for most of my academic career, I had no interest whatsoever in any form of academic leadership or administration. I had zero career interests in that sort of thing. You know, if we were talking 20 years ago and you told me that today that I would be dean of a business school, I would have laughed out loud at the absurdity of what you were proposing and suggested that you seek psychological help for your delusions, because I had no interest in it. You know, I was quite happy pursuing the career as a professor. My purpose, if we frame it in the words you're using today, was very much about being a teacher, about being an intellectual, about being a writer. And those are the things that I valued and pursued from a very, very young age, and continue to do so. it was about 10 years ago that I started to change a little bit and broaden my horizons. It was just around the time that I took my the role of head of the Department of Management here at UTS. And I think, I don't know if it's just getting older at the time, or but really started to turn my attention away just from these more academic, scholarly, and intellectual pursuits. And I started caring more about what is the overall value of the institution of the university, an institution that I'd always valued and always identified with and always wanted to be a part of, you know, no matter how flawed universities are. And they're very flawed. I've been, in my own work, as well as just in my own life, I've been very critical of universities, particularly business schools. I thought business schools have pretty much gone astray, you know, and kind of squandered the inheritance of the university that had been given to them by becoming overly focused on rankings and ratings and just competitive nature, really obsessed to the point of distraction with elite publications rather than engaging with real problems. You know, had brought in a worldview of competitiveness with other institutions, and it's all about beating other people and this, that, and the other. You know, an enchantment, if not obsession, with managerialism. And again, an implied purpose through all of this, that business schools were around to serve commercial and private interests rather than more broadly serving society. And so really, you know, an elitism in terms of institutional hierarchy, also an elitism, many business schools to this day pride themselves on judging how good they are by the salaries that their graduates earn. So really a kind of very set of values that run very contrary to mine. And I had been critical. I think I got to a point where I thought to myself, can I in some way contribute to business schools being different to that? You know, I never thought of myself as a hero, but more as part of a movement that might be looking to do something different, to pursue a different kind of business school. And here at UTS, I became deputy dean in 2018, and then dean in 2021. And so over that period of 6 years, we developed a new strategy, and you pointed to it as you introduced, of being a socially committed business school. That's very much in contrary to being an economically focused business school or a corporate focused business school, but it's a socially committed school and a focus on developing and sharing knowledge, the heart of the university, but to do that for a prosperous economy, for sustainability, and for innovation in a fairer world. And so all of that, in a sense, underlined a purpose of, is it possible for business education and research to create a more just world? Not to create more theories of justice, although they're important and necessary, but to create a more just world in very material and practical ways that improve people's lives. And that, over this period that I've been doing this job, is the purpose that I've dedicated myself to, a purpose very much rooted in values of justice, democracy, and shared prosperity. And how can we kind of encapsulate those values to create knowledge for the world, but also to educate a future generation of responsible leaders?
And a lot of younger people are looking for meaning and purpose. And I just wanted to quote quickly a couple of stats that Professor Andy Hoffman, who I believe is a colleague of yours, Bob's, originally from the Centre for POS-Orgs at Ross School of Business, now at Stanford. And in one of his YouTube, he quoted, this is Gallup 2019, 97% of young business professionals want a career with purpose. Business ethics entered the top 5 most popular subjects for the first time. This is in Financial Times. 67% of business students want to incorporate environmental sustainability considerations. That's from Yale. So is that aligning to your experience, Carl, in what students are actually looking for these days?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is true in a global sense. And I think the strategy that we've adopted here is very much in response to that, both in response to the changing aspects of what students are looking for and changing of what businesses are looking for. I don't think we could have successfully taken on such a purpose and strategy 10 years ago, maybe not even 5 years ago, because you still have to teach in a way that appeals to students who want to come and get this. And similarly, I don't think I could have done this job 5 or 10 years ago, because my values don't change over time. I think of myself in this kind of era of the students you're talking about. Like, imagine if you wear the same type of clothing your entire life, there are going to be 2 periods of history where you're in fashion. Right. And so this is the period for me as far as these kind of broader values. But hopefully it'll be much longer than a fashion, and these kind of changes that we see in young people, which fill me with a great sense of hope for the future at a time where often hope is hard to locate in the world. But when I see young people caring more, much more engaged socially, much more engaged politically, and caring in a different way about the future, that's not just about themselves and the kind of me generations that had grown up, my own included, in the 70s and 80s, there is a great deal of hope. And if we as a business school can foster that hope and help it grow and develop it, and to provide it some structure and direction, then I think we've done something worthwhile.
Absolutely, Carl. And we all understand how challenging it has been in the higher education sector in the past 4 or so years. How has purpose helped you, or perhaps the unit or the university more widely? Do you see some connections there in I guess in terms of some of the earlier research I presented about it giving you that motivation to persist despite the challenges?
I would say, I think this is the case both personally and in terms of work-related things. I mean, a sense of purpose, if you really believe it, I mean, if you keep changing your sense of purpose every 3 months, then, you got to ask yourself, is that really meaningful to you? But a true sense of purpose, I think, is absolutely essential in navigating tough times. Otherwise, you'll just get blown around in the wind, responding to the needs of the moment. And effectively not really achieving anything. But we've had massive changes, particularly, I mean, around the world, and some particular to Australia. COVID is the obvious one, which changed everything for us for that period, and changes subsequent, changing student expectations for universities like ours, which educate international students as well as Australian students. That whole thing has been very unpredictable. We've got changes in the wind around government policy in higher education, which has created greater uncertainty. We've got revenue challenges, funding challenges. If anything, I would say for Australian business schools, this last period since about 2020 has been the most challenging period we've had for decades. And sometimes I quip, that I picked the worst time in the entire history of Australian higher education to become the dean. But on the other hand, I mean, I'm joking there. Actually, on the other hand, I think I've picked the best time, because it's only, running with a tailwind, that doesn't require as much effort. That isn't where character shines through. I don't think you can distinguish entirely between the idea of character and the idea of purpose, and how can we bring purpose to drive a strength of character that can see through the hard times and the good times. So, without purpose, it's like sailing on a rough sea with no rudder. So absolutely essential, Susie.
Absolutely. And Professor Todd Kashdan, I'm not sure if he's still with us, but he refers to in his latest chapter to purpose and purpose in life as untapped potential. And I think for particularly our young students coming through, and we know from some of the work that's been done in the field of positive education, which I've been quite involved in primary and secondary high school, that generally there are lower levels of meaning than pleasure, if you like. If we're taking assessments of positive emotion versus meaning, there's lower levels of meaning, and hence we know there's a significant mental ill health issue. So I think there's a bit of a double or a triple whammy here, Carl, isn't there too, in terms of encouraging students to see the connection to the content, the curriculum, and then to their own sense of purpose and meaning, and the flow-on well-being effects that will have for them and their families and community.
Indeed, and that we incorporate that kind of thinking very much into our education here that we do. Rosemary's been a really key part of that as well. And I think what we need to bear in mind as university leaders, and I think what people forget too much, when it comes to undergraduates, especially people who join us just after or soon after leaving school. And so we've got young people who are part of the university getting an education, who will come here at age 17 or 18 and leave in their early 20s. That is a crucial period of life. You know, that is a period of becoming an adult, of leaving adolescence and childhood behind and becoming an adult who goes out to function in the world. Now, on the one hand, you might think of a business school as having the responsibility of teaching people a bunch of business skills so that they know how to do a marketing plan and to read a balance sheet and to, you know, and to understand management and all those kind of things. And those things are absolutely essential, of course, we do that. But I think what's much more important is that these young people grow up with us. You know, they grow up to some extent under our guidance. And that, if you think of education in that way, that is an awesome responsibility to have to take, you know, and one that we have to take seriously. And if we just reduce, as some people do, education to be providing people with a bag of skills so that they can go out and maximize their income generation potential in a competitive labor market, we've miserably failed those young people. So that's very strongly, that's kind of also part of what we're trying to do with the approach here at UTS Business School.
Thank you, Carl. That is music to my ears, and I'm sure everybody else on the call today. Thank you so much for the wonderful work that you're doing there. So I will move, because I know Rosemary's watching the clock today. I'm going to move to Corene Strauss. Corene Strauss is a cause-related CEO, and currently she's leading the Australian Disability Network since 2021. I've known Corene for a number of years as a friend and a colleague, and I know that she absolutely walks the talk. She's passionate about improving the lives of others and building communities for good. She has led the transformation of a number of organisations, including being the CEO of the Special Olympics, also the first female CEO appointed to the NRL, the National Rugby League's Men of League Foundation, and also prior to that, Legacy Australia. And she's currently, or just recently, been appointed to the board of directors for Invictus Australia. So Corene, welcome, and I'm very, very keen in our very brief amount of time today for you to share with everyone, I guess, first and foremost, your journey, because I know it's been a long one, and it's been an interesting one, but I'd love for you to highlight where purpose has had an interplay or a connection in the decisions that you've made in your life trajectory.
Thanks, Susie, and hello to everybody on the call, some of whom I know, and thank you for the opportunity to join you. So my career has been an amazing career, and I have really had the best life, even in challenging times. And I think really fundamental to that has been the way or my purpose in life. And to Carl's point about purpose and not changing it, I don't think I've ever deviated from what drives me, and that is that I have always set out to lead a meaningful life. And to positively impact those around me and the community in which I live. And for me, unity matters. And so whatever I've done, I have always sought to provide some meaningful impact in what I do, who I work for, who I work with, and those around me. So so my career has always been in the not-for-profit space since I was about 14 years old. I started a youth movement in our community to help fundraise for those in need. And that movement continued on for years and years later. And I have always been in the not-for-profit space and mindset. I loved what Carl said about the business school. I am from the business school background myself. I was the Associate Director at the Australian Graduate School of Management years ago. And again, another reason why I was in the education sector at University of New South Wales is because I really believe in improving the lives of others, right? And so education is a really important tool for all of us to have to learn to be better in what we do in school, skills and resources. And so good on you, Carl, for doing what you're doing at UTS. I love the purpose, and I really hope that it goes from strength to strength. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. I'm quite happy to sit on the couch and answer questions.
So Corene, currently in your role as CEO at the Australian Network for Disability, I'm aware that there's a very compelling, purposeful story by the founder as well. And I know we don't have a lot of time today, but I was really fortunate to sit in and hear the power of that story on the people. I'm wondering if you could just speak to that briefly and how that continues to impact people.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, it was founded by John and Steve Bennett, and their father was disfigured in the war and he could never get a job. And so they settled here in Australia, and they had a business called Benbro Electronics, and they started to hire people with disability. And they found that, you know, they would have to make 100 phone calls to find one person, and that was not optimal. And so what they did is they formed a group of people to try and create impact by educating and informing and building the disability confidence of employers, and doing multiple processes and procedures so that people with disability could apply and be welcome and included in the organization. That's the fire hose version. If anyone is interested in knowing more and seeing Steve's story, I can send you a video link of it. I've just seen a video interview of him. So amazing human being.
Thank you, Corene. And how do you personally stay connected to your purpose, particularly with the challenges of running, I guess, a not-for-profit and the current financial challenges that we're experiencing? How does that help you on a day-to-day basis?
All I can say is thank God I have purpose and I understand why I'm doing what I'm doing, because it really helps me stay focused on really dark days. And let me tell you that it is running a not-for-profit, and certain not-for-profits have been very challenging. And so when it's really difficult, I say, cut your whinging and lead, and remember why you're doing this. Remember why you're doing this, because somewhere out there will be in the same space as me and will understand why I'm doing it, and I'll find the support I need to do. And the same thing with the team that I have. So I have a team, and as long as my team understand what our purpose is. So here at Australian Disability Network, the most amazing organization I have ever worked for. I love it. I love it. I absolutely love it. But our purpose is to build the disability confidence of Australians and people around the world. And every day when there may be a little challenge, we remind ourselves that if we can build the confidence of one more Australian to welcome and include a person with disability in the workplace and as a customer, then we've nailed it. It's one more person, and that is our purpose. That's my lighthouse.
And Corene, you do see, or I personally heard throughout my profession, a fair bit of cynicism about, you know, purpose statements or vision statements or even values on the wall that people walk past every day and are completely habituated to, or, you know, not connected to. Do you have any tips for people listening today on how to continually keep that alive for people? Like, is it woven into the operating rhythms of the organization in terms of team meetings or regular professional development? Any tips that you might have?
So I've had a long career. I'm on the other side of the equation, and I have finally learned how to do it. And I would say we speak about it every day. So I always talk about our lighthouse, which is our purpose. And I describe everything we do is this building our lighthouse brighter? and is it making it bigger? And that is our purpose, which is to build the disability conference. So whatever we do today, guys, is it building our lighthouse? Is it making it shine bright? So we all understand what we need to do, and we all have what I'm a great believer in autonomy. And so if everybody understands the purpose and they have the autonomy to do what they need to do, we thrive and we really lean in as a team. It's amazing. Purpose as your lighthouse is what makes you stand strong every day.
Quinn, just remind me, what's headcount at your organisation? How many people?
We are currently 56. When I started 3 and a bit years ago, we were 21. So we've grown a lot.
Yes, and I'm assuming, well, I probably know more than an assumption that it is seemingly easier when you've got a smaller organisation. I know you've worked at larger organisations, and Bob made a really important point in terms of the middle managers. I've seen that, Bob, happen before, where it's an email out rather than a real connection with people. And of course, it can be much more challenging the larger the organisation. And perhaps Bob might be able to share an example when we get to the Q&A, because I listened to a podcast yesterday, Bob, about, I think it might have been KPMG, one of the big four, as to how they got purpose out across, I don't know, thousands and thousands of people. But Corene, any final tips before we...
Yes. Bob nailed it, and I wanted to speak on that or mention this topic. He talked about his organizational purpose. He talked about discover, authentic, constant, and then he talked about enroll management, and he said enroll workforce. Can I say one of the biggest lessons I've learned in my entire career, and I've learned it through the disability sector, and it's the thing called co-design. Whatever you do, we co-design everything in our organization, and that is how you understand what it is that you need to achieve. And so that's, for me, another great lesson about co-design.
Yes, thank you. And it also, co-design aligns to the complementary field to POS and POS-Psych of appreciative inquiry. And we've recently, I'm very privileged to say, we've been working with Diabetes Australia. We've just started a 18-month program with them. We started off with appreciative inquiry summits, and it's been a fantastic way to engage people and to hear their voice, and to get that shared mission between, not just from the top, but between everybody. So thank you so much, Corene, again, for the incredible work that you do. You're an inspiration. And thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for asking me. My pleasure.
So, Rosemary, I'm handing over to you now, I believe.
Thank you, Susie. And thank you, Bob, Carl and Corene, for your comments and thoughts. So just moving to the part of the morning where we have a bit of a panel discussion and leaving enough time for our Q&A session. Listening to everyone, I put up on the chat, I've made this up, purpose washing, since we hear about greenwashing, etc., and not wanting to be cynical, because as I was reading recently, it's cynicism that is associated with burnout, and cynicism comes from inauthentic vision statements, values, purpose. And yet, Bob, I have heard you talk about or write about the assumption, a dominant assumption, that people act out of self-interest. Our board structures in corporate governance are built on that. The board is there to control the CEO, who otherwise will just act out of self-interest. And that kind of permeates through the organisation, that ultimately we all act out of self-interest. Yet here we are talking about purpose. And that sometimes, I think I've read, CEOs will think, well, okay, that's it. We've got our purpose statement. That's done. On with the next thing. And so a kind of a lack of depth, lack of reflection. So I'm front loading this as a question for everyone that's on the call and they're thinking about how to build purpose into their organisation, anything from a small not-for-profit to something larger, how to bring that up with their management. So yeah, I guess a question around your collective experiences of how to embed purpose in an organization? What advice would you give to the many listeners on the call, and thinking here especially to that point of authenticity? So Bob, first to you. Oh, you'll need to unmute. Yeah.
Three quick responses. One is when we founded Positive Organization Scholarship in 2000, Kim Cameron and I started to circle the globe teaching week-long sessions for executives all over the world. For 4 days, they would drink it in. They loved the research. They loved the findings. On Friday, I'd say, okay, what are you going to go home and do differently? They didn't do this. They did this. That is, they were terrified by the question. It took me 3 years to figure out why this response was so constant. And the short version is, if you accept any of the principles that come out of the science of positive organizing or positive psychology, you're engaging in some form of positive deviance. So if you say, okay, we're going to have gratitude circles or practice appreciative inquiry, you've instantaneously introduced something outside of the economic hierarchical mindset. And you will be neutralized. Whenever you deviate from the norm negatively or positively, you are pushed back to the norm by negative peer pressure. Your subordinates control you. We got a great dean sitting here, but he has to deal with faculty members who are trying to influence him and control him all the time. That's the nature of the beast, right? People are terrified of being laughed at, of being neutralized. If you don't have a purpose that's driving you, you're not going to deviate from the norm. So you're going to be mediocre. And we never do a session that someone doesn't walk up to me at the end and say, oh, this all sounds so good. You just don't know my company. You see, we're a fill in the blank company. We can't do this. Or you don't know my boss. My boss is a monster. It can't be done here. That is, the vast army of mankind, or legions of mankind, live in learned helplessness, which, by the way, was the root of positive psychology. And there's a shift that's necessary where you care enough that you take a risk to do good. That's a conversion. That's a change from the reactive life that comes with the basic economic paradigm of self-interested people, which is accurate, by the way. Most of the time, most of us are acting in self-interest, competing for resources, etc. The second real quick response is in one of the companies we worked with that transformed dramatically, they had a board member. The board member was General Joe Roby, retired, who was the CEO of USA Insurance, a really respected company for a very long time. And this CEO went out to visit USA Insurance, and he went to their call centers. He came out of the call centers and said, Joe, what's going on? I have call centers, but they don't look like this. Your people smile. Your people are unified. Your people are treating the customer with incredible delicacy. That's not my call centers. What's going on here? And then Roby said a sentence that I think is profoundly important, that 99% of the people I tell it to just shrug their shoulders. They see no value in the sentence I'm about to utter. What Roby said was, the highest purpose of a leader is to continually clarify the purpose. That's profoundly important because people live in organizations where self-interest will naturally occur at every turn. And so if I'm in the business school and I'm on the staff, the HR staff or the accounting staff or whatever, some staff function, every day I'm solving problems and self-interest is operating constantly. I may be very committed to Carl's purpose or vision or Corene's purpose or vision, but the forces of life are pushing me away from it at every turn. So when Roby says the highest purpose of a leader is to continually clarify the purpose, he means it, right? That's the constancy effect. When you meet someone like Corene, you people are half a planet away from me. I can smell Corene, right? She smells different. She instantly steps off the screen at me. I know her. I've seen her 1,000 times. She's absolutely rare. She does not occur with frequency, but there's a lot of her, and they occur in all kinds of places. And they all talk funny, just like she just talked funny. Was using strange language and doing these strange things. Purpose-driven leaders do. So I'll just stop. There's a couple other things, but yeah, those are things that jump out at me.
Great comments. Thank you. I see someone's put something about the PwC tax scandal we've got happening here in Australia at the moment, and which is a reminder that large and complex organisations mean there's an even larger and more complex task for that leader to keep revisiting continually the purpose. Carl or Corene, would you like to respond to what Bob has just been talking about?
I wouldn't mind responding a little bit to the PwC comment as well, actually, because it's a very interesting one, particularly in relation to what was just talked about self-interest. And clearly, this scandal, for those who don't know, involved PwC working for the Australian government to provide advice on how to curb corporate tax avoidance, only then to sell the information and to attempt to sell the information about their plans to the corporations who are doing the tax avoidance. So it was ethically void, and it was a big scandal and continues to be a big scandal in this country based on, in this case, the pursuit of self-interest. And there's so much talked about self-interest that it's almost as if, people have become more self-interested because we've been told we have to be homo economicus, and therefore we become. But people naturally care about other people too. I think when it comes to business, corporate purpose is important, but it is possible, I think, as you intimated before, Rosemary, to have some kind of purpose washing. And the worst thing about purpose washing is when leaders of corporations fool themselves into believing their own false sense of purpose, should that be the case, and fool themselves into believing that they can, follow some fairly utopian purpose that sounds like it was written by the same people who write those inserts in the middle of Hallmark greeting cards for Mother's Day or whatever the case. Very kind of twee. Because it's important also not to forget that if we look at business organizations in particular, they exist only by the grace of society. Business organizations are created through legal structures that create and regulate and enable business, trade, and markets to exist. Without society, you have no business. And I think we've too much kind of flipped the direction and assumed that society is there to serve business rather than business being there to serve society. And any purpose of any meaning can only come to that. And not to forget, there are some fairly basic ways such a broad purpose can be achieved. And they often get overlooked, I think, in discussions of purpose. Because the main ways that businesses can serve society are, A, by paying taxes, which many of them go to great lengths to avoid doing. Secondly, by offering meaningful, secure, and fairly and well-paid employment. Again, we get the precariat and the kind of growth of Uber-style working arrangements. Thirdly, it's about creating innovation that leads to economic growth and the possibility of shared prosperity. And in face of that, we often get profiteering and monopolistic selfish practices. And fourthly, it's about providing goods and services that are of true value, where instead we often get rentier capitalism and kind of abuse of financialization. So I think there's an absolutely basic sense of, there's also a common purpose perhaps that business can have, and often that gets lost. And I think it's important to keep that alive as part of this discussion as well.
Great, thanks, Carl. Corene, would you like to make any comments, and then we'll move on to the Q&A?
No, let's go to the Q&A. I'm sure the participants would want to have some questions answered. So over to you.
All right. So there's a few things happening in the chat. Susie, would you like to pull out a question from the Q&A?
Yeah, I think the first question by Satomi was when the term positive organisational, where did it come from? And I think, Bob, I think we have recognised that you were one of the co-founders along with Jane Dutton, who we've had previously, and Kim Cameron, who we've also had previously. But I guess more interestingly for me, the question is how commonly is this term being used now? Here in Australia, I mean, in every presentation I give, I'm certainly quoting the research body along with other sciences. But yeah, what would your response to that be?
The term took off fairly quickly in the academic world, in the sense that it's pretty well recognized that there's a body of literature called positive organization scholarship, just as there is positive psychology. It doesn't play well with practitioners. They don't know what to make of it. So it often even we do sessions on positive leadership because it's a little more understandable, or we'll change that name. And so you're always trying to communicate with the general market. But as an academic endeavor, it was definitely seen as a subfield that had a particular message, and yeah, that's it.
Well, I can certainly attest to going to the website, Bob, because many moons ago when I first went there, it was in the early days quite academically focused as the research started to grow. But in recent years, there's so many wonderful case studies and very practical applications that are highlighted. So I'd encourage everyone to go to the Centre for Positive Organisations website.
Yeah,
sorry, Bob, you go.
No, go ahead, please.
I know I was just going to pull out another question, but please feel free to comment. All good?
Yeah, we're all good.
Rosemary, I'm not sure if there's any that are standing out to you. There was one question around thoughts on organisations expending resources to maintain a social licence to operate. I'm not sure if I entirely understand that question, but Rosemary or the panel, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, anonymous attendee.
Yes.
I wonder if this is alluding to the kind of tensions and between meeting the needs of multiple stakeholders. So there's your shareholders, let's say it's a corporation, and making profits versus the social or your broader stakeholders, and inevitably there is tensions and trade-offs in meeting all of those different needs, and decisions have to be made, and usually they're around resources. So I'm assuming that that's what this is about. And I guess what I'm getting from the conversation is that this is an ongoing thing. So as Bob has said, the importance of the leader to continually clarify the purpose, and presumably that means that organisational purposes also need to shift, adapt. Would you agree with that, Bob? Because there are those tensions. Like for us in the higher education sector in Australia, we're about to go through another kind of, well, it seems to be on the horizon, another kind of series of pressures with loss of income from less international students, for instance. Yet our universities all have different sorts of public purposes, limited resources, and sometimes tough decisions have to be made. Does the purpose then need to adapt? What do you think?
Well, I think first of all, there's an underlying process. We live in the highest rate of uncertainty than any human system has ever lived in before. The political conditions around the world attest to that. When things become totally uncertain, we have certain predictable political shifts that we're seeing all over the world. And that's a function of fear. When we don't feel that we control our environment and we feel threatened, as we look at the teenagers across the world today, the statistics are just terrifying of how out of control they feel that their life is, right? Adults are the same. What does purpose do in an individual or a company? Purpose gives you the capacity to step into uncertainty with the intention of learning how to adapt. That's what purpose does for you. So it allows your system to be an adaptive, innovative system. When I listened to Carl describe the business school, that's not the descriptions I heard 10 years ago of any business schools. He's adapting, he's stepping in uncertainty, he's learning, he's changing, and the system is changing. Purpose does that, and purpose is always about, I saw several of the comments on the chat about asking some basic questions. We have a lot of research on the difference between ego goals and contribution goals. I have a lot of ego goals, and so does everybody else on this call. I spend a lot of time in self-interest. I also sometimes transcend self-interest. And when I do, I start talking like Corene. Oh, my life is great, right? She has a great life because she's been marching to a different drummer. Sometimes I succeed in doing that. A lot of times I fail, and I go to the default option, which is ego. But that research basically has a set of dependent variables. It looks just like the list I showed about purpose in terms of all the positive outcomes, right? As we move from self-interest, competition, preservation of resources, conservation resources, to creation of resources, contribution of resources, we live differently individually, and we live differently collectively. We go into, Corene used that wonderful word unity, or maybe it was Susie. Always it's about unity. Some person transforms, they begin to see the collective good, they articulate the collective good, which is the purpose, and it creates trust, it creates covenant, it creates a different kind of conversation. Learning peaks in that organization. That organization has capacity other organizations don't have. And so you violate economic assumptions and you make more money because you have capacities arising and emerging, that's the key word, emerging, that the other companies don't have. And yet economic reasoning just cannot deal with it, right? So you're basically increasing consciousness, operating from a different drummer, and getting different results.
Excellent.
So that question by Carolyn, how important is identity to organizational purpose? She says it's not talked about nearly enough, but having clarity on your unique organizational identity seems to me to be key to connecting to the purpose. For me, having done a significant amount of work on individual levels of meaning and purpose, we often start with values, helping people reflect and crystallize and then prioritize their values. And then we move to the vision, Bob, like or the purpose. Mm-hmm. But from the way that we've come at it, I've come at it largely has been around values clarification first in terms of who am I? And then, what is the best use of my strengths? What is the purpose then of the strengths of the values that I have and the strengths that I have? How would that align, I guess, in terms of this question here, in organizational identity and organizational purpose?
Well, I think that the thing that's hardest to process about purpose is that it's a moral endeavor. And that immediately terrifies people. But when Carl talks about these student needs and what he's trying to do, and he says, we're trying to grow these people, that's a parental function, right? That's a family function. And growing them is not about putting information about marketing into their head. Now, that's intellectual growth, but they need physical growth, they need social growth, they need spiritual growth. And we now have a science of spirituality. right? Spirituality is real. We measure it and we know lots about it. We ought to be able to grow Carl students on all 4 of those dimensions. And if we're not, they're not growing. And so purpose brings that moral dimension to the organization. People can feel honorable about what they're doing. They have a reason to get up and get out of bed in the morning. They also become empowered. Just a quick illustration. I was at a company in Ohio. This mid-level woman was speaking. She said, this morning, my boss said, we're going to do X. And I said, no, we're not. Now, every head snapped and looked at her. And she said, I said to him, that's not consistent with our company's purpose. And the boss said, oh, thank you very much. That's so helpful. At that moment, the CEO leaned in. He was sitting next to me. He said, do you see what I mean? When purpose is the arbiter of every decision, every person's empowered. Every person can make decisions about what to do. Well, most people cannot comprehend that, right? That's outside the self-interested, hierarchical, conventional mindset. You have to learn your way into that. Corene started at 14, but she's had a series of experiences where she's constantly had expansion of consciousness. And she understands it more and more deeply. The reason I say she smells differently, I can see it, I can hear that model. She understands it. She's speaking about it in different pieces. People can't talk like her.
Thanks, Bob. Again, I'm very much still on a learning journey, but someone had made reference to the parallels between individual adult development and organizational, I guess, development. And I can't quote the reference for it, but in my training, I'm pretty sure it was like the majority of organizations are still at conventional stages of thinking or at that achiever, you know, so which is probably still very self-focused. And it's not until you move into that post-conventional that you start to think more systemically. And so I wondered too whether this is a reflection. I'm not sure. I'm all for evolution, and hopefully that's the direction we're moving in. But sometimes you can lose a little bit of faith when you see what's happening in the world. How do you keep your purpose and faith going, Bob?
Say the last sentence again.
How do you keep your sense of purpose and hopefulness given what's happening in the world right now?
You know, at a personal level, it's a discipline. It's every single day trying to return to it. I mean, my short version is my purpose is to inspire positive change, not to instruct, not to take my science and instruct people. It's much bigger responsibility. I have to inspire them. That requires more than knowledge. It requires authenticity. It requires seeing their potential. It requires a lot of things. It's to inspire positive change. The average professor doesn't take that accountability. Their accountability is to inform people about their research, right? So I fall away. I become a hypocrite constantly. I slip away from that. So I have to constantly clarify. The moment I do, those words transform my being. I go from unfocused to focused. I go from fearful to courageous. I take on virtues. I immediately then begin to inspire positive change. And I hold myself accountable to that in every setting, whether it's in front of a classroom or if I'm in somebody else's meeting. Can I change this meeting to be a better meeting without usurping the authority of the person in the room? That's a very unusual question to be asking, right? So it's a very high level of accountability. But I think that's exactly the same thing that Roby is saying about the company. The leader's responsibility is to clarify the purpose of the whole constantly, every meeting, conversation, every symbol on the wall, because the organization will break down into silos. Most organizations are siloed, and silos are simply clusters of self-interest. And so that's the challenge.
And giving people the space. I mean, people's lives and organisational lives are so jam-packed that there's hardly any breathing space or self-reflective space. And I think that's crucially important for a leader that is working in a purpose-driven organisation. Rosemary, over to you.
Yeah,
We've got a lot of time left.
We've got 1 minute left, Susie. I was going to do a quick whip around, but just any other sort of last comments, Carl or Corene?
Only just to say thank you, Rosemary and Susie, for organising this event. It's been great to be a part of it, and judging from the comments, really engaged for the audience. So, you know, thanks for putting the time and effort into making these things possible for everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. And my closing comment is to all participants here. If you know what your purpose is in your organisation, or you know what your organisation's purpose is, keep that front and centre in your conversations every day, because that's what brings clarity, empowerment, and drives change and impact. Love what you do too. It really helps.
Okay, well, look, there's just been so many points raised this morning. I have to go back and look at them all. I really love that concept of accountability of purpose as well. There's a lot to it, isn't there? And just that kind of bolstering effect that it has, even in challenging times, which is the times that we're living in. So just half a minute to thank you all for coming along, especially Bob. I know it's now probably 8:30 or 9 in the evening over there. And to Corene and to Carl, thank you so much for your time. Susie, my partner in crime. And a big shout out to Rebecca Whalen from the Business School, Beck, who's living behind that UTS Business School screen. Doing that's above and beyond her role, because she believes in the topics that we've been discussing. So thank you, Beck. And thank you, everybody, for joining. And of course, we'll have the recording posted. You'll get a link in the email, and we'll put up some resources as well. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Rosemary.
Thank you, Rosemary. Thank you, Susie. And Bob.
Thanks, Bob.